You mentioned several times two books from Christopher Alexander. First, The Pattern Language, and then the book of the tapestries.
Foreshadowing of 21st century art.
Different colors weaving together, but in total it's one.
Whatever happens in 20th century art, I'm sure it will come out of the practice of popular culture now, not out of the fine art culture. I think fine art culture has sort of run its course in a way as a source for the future. That doesn't mean I don't enjoy it, but I think it's slightly archaic now. When I look at what's happening in popular culture is like the tropics, the tropics where there's so many species and so many niches and so many different ways of surviving, and there's constant generation of new things. Those things get wiped out and other ones take their place, and some survive and become strong and dominate, and it's a completely tropical situation in popular culture for the last 40 or 50 years. And, in tropical culture, I'm including film, television, popular music. Fine art culture has tried to sort of resist being in these tropics because it's a dangerous place to be, because you can get wiped out very quickly. And fine art culture has tried to resist this by trying to take itself to a higher and higher plateau so that the flood wouldn't reach it, And it's up on a plateau there, and it's defended by critics and curators and various other people who build a sort of fence of a defence around it, actually saying you're not allowed to touch this. This does not belong in the same world, and it shouldn't be subject to the same rules. It's fine. You can say that, and you're allowed to say that, and it's something that religions do a lot. It's something that lots of human institutions insulate themselves in that way. And I can see the value of it. But the problem is the flood keeps rising, and the bit of hilltop they're on keeps getting smaller and smaller. They have to keep retreating further up the hill, and they're crowded round on this little top bit here. And, the future, it seems to me, is for those who leave the hilltop and jump into the water. Certainly the fine artists that I find most interesting now are the ones who, in a sense, leave the top of the pyramid and say, I'm going to try it, see what it's like in there, see how my work survives there. Damien Hirst would be an example of that, of someone who's quite deliberately adapted the pose of pop culture. Though actually I think his work is very classical in a way. He's taken the pose of the pop star, but he somehow hasn't made the work that quite belongs with that.
But also anyway, Steve Reich, for example, the old master, he also in a way left the classical field.
Yeah, he went back.
No.
They all left. They all left in the 60s and early 70s, but they all went back. Because the other thing about the top of the hill, is that there's a lot of money there.
Opera.
Opera, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to be cynical. I'm not saying so they went where the money was, but if you're a composer and somebody says to you, we will finance you to write a piece for an 80-piece orchestra, and we'll guarantee you 16 shows in opera houses throughout Europe, and we'll guarantee blah, 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 blah. Or, okay, that's your one option. Now the other option is, well, you can try to see what you can put together and go to some record company and say, I'm writing some kind of opera, will you back it? What are you going to do? If you're a composer, you see, one of the difficult things is that there's really hardly any middle ground. You're either in the pop world with all of its values and its highly competitive nature, or you're in the classical world with its extremely defended and in many ways corrupt internal structure.
But is it only in Europe like that, or also in the United States? Because
I think it's there as well, really.
Yes?
Yeah. It's like there are two plateaus, you know. There's the pop plateau and the classical one. But in the middle, it's very difficult to survive for most people. You're sort of forced somewhat to the edges, because that's where the money is, you know. The classical plateau has money because it appeals to respectability. So it's a respectable place for governments to spend money. You know, our government spends such a huge amount of its money for the arts supporting the English National Opera and the Royal Opera House and so on. It's a disgraceful amount of money, actually. And it's only justified by the thought that this is somehow very culturally important. If you take that away, and if you say, well, I don't think it's any more important than football or cake decoration or, you know, blues clubs or something like that, if you took that away, that respectability, people would say, well, we can't possibly spend 40% of our annual music budget on the Royal Opera House on that basis. So it's defended by that kind of respectability. And that's why money goes there. It is thought to symbolize the enduring value of our culture.
But your work were always between, you fight for 25 years now for that, in a way, for this field between.
Well, I think I've fought a good fight.
No, but this is like discrete music, you know, nobody in that time thought, Brian, you know, what's that for music, you know, what's that, you know, nobody expect things like that in that time in the 70s.
Actually, I bet it would be a lot harder to release that record now. The record business is much less tropical now than it was then. You know, the record business has really consolidated itself into a business over the last few years. You know, the most recent thing is this big takeover of Polygram by Seagrams. So there's now this big company called Unigram. And I've seen what effect that's had on the record business. You know, it just creates, I'm sure there are no bad intentions involved, but it creates a culture of accountancy, essentially, where it really does become important that things sell. And therefore, it becomes important not to invest too much time in weird things. Now, it's becoming more like the film business. You know, what was great about pop music as a business for many years was that nobody knew what the rules were. And there were constantly new things coming up that surprised the business. I'm sure this will continue to happen to some extent. But it meant then that a lot of companies were willing to invest a certain amount of their money in kind of strange things, just because one of them might pay off, you know. It wasn't that much money, you could keep a few of those things going, and one of them might pay off. And sometimes they did. What happened in Hollywood, film-wise, was that the big studios gained more and more control of distribution, which is to say they didn't really have to worry that much about the possibility that something would come up on its own and pay off, because they controlled what would come up. You know, so they could say, we own 1,400 theatres in America and we're going to make this film a success. Because ours is going to be the only film in town. You know, there aren't going to be that many other options. Well, of course, the solution to this currently is, the solution to the distribution bottleneck is the internet, where, you know, once again, the promise of independent record companies, which have been so important in this country, well, in Europe in general, I think, the independents have really been the exciting laboratories for new music. And I think that will happen again, you know, if I can make music in there and distribute it through that thing. So I don't have to go through the structure of a distribution system. That will work for a little while, but that won't work for long.
But as you have seen, for instance, with underground distribution channels, eventually also were taken over by the big money, bottom line thinking companies.
Yes.
So that will happen probably again.
Yes, that's why I said it won't probably last for long. But actually, it's slightly more hopeful here, because the next role that will appear, at the moment we have the artist and we have the record company distributor complex. There are those two things. Mm-hmm. So what we're saying about the internet is that it allows the artist to expose work without going through that complex. Okay, you're quite right that complex is going to buy in as soon as they can. But something else will happen as well, which is a new character will evolve, who will be the professional curator. What I can imagine in the future is that, there's going to be so much music and material parked out on the internet. The biggest problem is going to be trying to find anything you like in all of that. It's the biggest problem now on the internet, Trying to actually filter is the difficult problem. So the next big job is the job of filter. For instance, say I took it upon myself to say, I'm going to spend my time just looking around and seeing what new music is appearing on the net. And then I'm going to create a service where I charge people. I say, this is what you ought to listen to. This is my selection this week of what's going on the net. And you can buy it through me. I get something for it, and the artist gets something for it. Because there are no costs on the internet, it's so cheap. I can charge 1/100th of a penny for that service, and I could make a living doing it. I don't plan to do this, by the way, but I'm saying this is the future. So there'll be a new kind of person who'll be an editor, a curator or editor, if you like. The next phase after that is the phase of corruption of the editors.
New internet payola.
Yeah, and that will happen within 3 years, I'd say. So I think what will happen is that a lot of trust relationships will grow up. And trust relationships are the ones that are typified by the small shop, the small retailer, the independent record company, I think that will be, if you want a picture for the future of 21st century culture, that's part of it. But of course the other part is the absolute opposite of that. The label culture, Nike and so on, the things where your trust is based entirely on your participation in a common consensus. Okay, everybody else is wearing Nike, so I guess it must be good. That's an entirely different kind of trust. That's a sort of trust in democracy, actually. It is, isn't it? Yeah. It's the majority decision, so it must be okay.
But isn't that just a reshaping of somewhat older values that people would like to have utensils or tools to associate with something? I mean, mm-hmm. If you were a jazz lover in the 40s, it came with a certain type of dressing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you could relate to each other.
Yes, that's
you
right.
wear this, I wear this, so probably we both like Dizzy.
Yes, that's right. I think that is the same thing. You subscribe to a cultural consensus. It's a democratic thing, It's the failure of democracy, actually. The tragedy of democracy is that it doesn't produce. It doesn't necessarily produce originality and difference. You can very easily see this in the difference between Russia and America. I lived in Russia for a while, and Russia is a mad country. It's a country of individuals, really, really eccentric people in some ways. If you go to America, it's a country of conformists quite a lot. Now, of course, neither of these pictures is really true. There are a lot of very, very wild and interesting people in America, and there are a lot of total lumpen proletariat in Russia. But nonetheless, you would expect from their cultural histories that America would be full of free-thinking egalitarians. But it isn't. It's full of moral majoritarians and Nazi splinter groups, all sorts of extremely reactionary thinkers. Okay, well, we're in Hyde Park, the great gift to London. It's one of our royal parks, actually. I noticed yesterday it's called a royal park, like Regent's Park and some of the others. It's probably one of the biggest city parks in Europe, I would say, wouldn't you? It's a very big park.
Very big, yeah.
And it's quite near my studio, and I often come here to pretend I'm working. I say to myself, I think I'll go and sit in Hyde Park and do this.
Yeah.
And I come and sit in Hyde Park and do nothing.
But now you've got this set up as an excuse.
Yeah, so now I am working. So we have, since this is Hyde Park, we have lots of dogs and children and young mothers here.
Jesus, this is hot.
Did you burn your tongue?
Almost. Ooh.
Co has just burnt his tongue, which means you won't be hearing anything more from him for the rest of the program. So I have to talk now.
Blessing in disguise.
This was a clever conspiracy. I arranged this with the guy who runs the cafe.
Dear, that's not bad. Want to see it?
No, actually, I'll get self-conscious. You just do them and show me later.
Yeah.
Okay.
That voice in the background there, number 8. See, when you order food at this little cafe we're sitting in, they give you a number and then announce it, so you're going to hear a lot of that.
And I can smoke.
Yeah.
No problem at all.
Yeah, we don't outlaw smoking in the parks yet.
You never smoked?
Yeah, I do smoke.
You do smoke too?
Not very much, though. I smoke. I've smoked 1 or 2 cigarettes a day since I was about 8. But I've never smoked a lot.
But no cigars. Or cigars too?
No.
This Richard Rorty book, it's also a book you mentioned a lot. What he mentioned was personal fashioning. Mm-hmm. And if you compare that with the ideas of this Christopher Alexander pattern language, what perhaps this language connect us together in a way. These two writers have something to do with each other. I follow it very much.
I have to say that I think it's interesting to me that I like both of those writers a lot, but I think there's an absolute and fundamental disagreement between the two, and it's been one of my philosophical problems to try to sort that out, because Christopher Alexander's books are written on the assumption that there are fundamental human laws, or not even human, but almost divine laws of proportion and of rightness in architecture. The whole of Rorty's philosophy speaks against that view. What Rorty says is that humans arrive at things by consensus, and that there is no higher authority to call upon. We arrive at things by consensus, and we can choose to enforce them by consensus, but we can't defend them by invoking some higher law. He says there isn't a higher law, or if there is, it's not worth trying to invoke it. It's too complex to invoke it. And so I think this is it's very interesting to me that I can like both of these writers and feel that they are connected, and yet sense that there's a fundamental disagreement between them.
But this entanglement philosophy from last week from the New Scientist, that meant that we are connected,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's no contradiction at all between Christopher Alexander and Rorty, because then human beings made always this construction with it,
Mm-hmm.
because they want to be individual, special, they want to build something.
Well, the difference is probably a difference in how you describe something. I mean, certainly my reading of Rorty is to say that there are human constructions that are so deep within us that they are similar to fundamental laws. As far as we're concerned, they're fundamental. He makes the philosophical point, with which I agree, that we cannot use the appeal to fundamentalism as a defense of those forms of behavior. So what he tries to say, I think, is stop using God or whatever other construction outside of ourselves as a justification for our decisions. We must justify our decisions on the basis of our needs and our wants, and on the basis of the understanding that we made those decisions. They weren't made for us. So it's in a way a taking responsibility for oneself and one's culture. But what you're hearing in the background here is the process that we're talking about of a human being taught how to reach consensus. You know, when you speak to a child, what you're doing all the time is you're not actually giving them specific information. You're saying, this is how we do things, this is how we do things, this is how we do things, this is how we do things. That's all that speaking to a child is about, really. It's a sort of inviting them into the family that you belong to, you know, inviting them into the cultural family. And
but then at a certain moment, it's so strange, it stopped, and then the rules coming up, strange rules people made for them.
No, but there are, you know, we're embedded in lots of sets of rules. We've got our, you know, you could have one set of rules with your brother, which is embedded within the set of rules you have with your family, which is with your local set of rules. But there are frictions between all of them, and we know well enough when to use which set of rules. You know, I know that I don't behave with you like I would with my children. I know that we have to have different sets of rules for those situations. So that's another point that Rorty is making. He's saying that that we don't actually exist in absolute sets of rules, that we have lots and lots of pictures of the world, and we juggle them around, and we know which one to use at which moment. And you see, I think Christopher Alexander is a great thinker, but I think he's not philosophically clear about what he's thinking. I don't think he needs to make that appeal he's making to some sort of extra-human, superhuman set of rules. And I think it's old-fashioned. You know, it's like all that stuff about the golden mean and, you know, ideal proportions and that sort of Renaissance thing of humanism, the idea that there are built into us fundamental rules of that kind.
The cosmos is built by rules, by structures.
Yeah, and I don't think it's necessary to. It doesn't illuminate anything to say that, and it doesn't help his argument to say that, and it gives him a philosophical weak point that he can be attacked on. And it's a shame, because it's the wrong place to attack him. You know, it's not the most interesting part of what he's saying, but it weakens his position, I think.
Generative music, is it something to do with pattern language, music patterns?
I think it is, in a sense, yes. Yes, because actually it's an interesting connection that I hadn't made, so thank you for that. Generative music is the idea that composing instead of being the attitude, the job of creating particular patterns of notes and rhythms and melodies and so on, designing pieces of music, instead of that, composing in this form is designing systems that create pieces of music. So you're not actually designing the music in detail. You're constructing some kind of, shall we say, a machine.
Meta language.
Yeah, it can be a language or some kind of grammar by which music is made. To give an example, I could give you a precise recipe for making a cake. I could say take 4 ounces of flour, 2 ounces of butter, 6 teaspoons of sugar, and blah, blah, blah. I could give you a very precise recipe for making a cake. Or I could say, if you combine flour with water and butter and eggs, and you let them sit together for a while, and you do this, and then you sprinkle a bit of this on top. So I don't give precise instructions, but I talk about a technique of making cakes. And then you can go and make a lot of different cakes with that, rather than just the one cake of the precise recipe. So this is a way of saying, of designing structures that then make music for you. And it's not a completely new idea by any means. For instance, some of the music of Steve Reich is like that, and Philip Glass. Some of their earlier music were in fact designs for machines that made music, basically. What's interesting about this is that the composer, of course, will never hear all of the music that one of those systems will produce. So it means that it's making music that you didn't specifically compose in the traditional sense of composing. My approach to this started years ago, really, with discrete music, I suppose, was the first thing I released like this, which is a... perhaps you'd play a little bit of that. Basically, it's two melodies, two synthesizer melodies, which are of incompatible lengths. You know, one of them, let's say, I don't know how long they are, but let's say one of them is 7.9 seconds long and the other is 9.31 seconds long or something like that. And these two melodies exist separately and are therefore constantly crossing over one another in different ways. And of course in music what you always hear is the total picture. You hear the cluster at any given moment. So with a simple system like that, where you have two things that are running out of sync with each other, you have a recipe for an endlessly long piece of music, actually. It's going to carry on doing that until they happen to come back in sync again, which might be a very long time. So I did a lot of music like this. Music for Airports is the same kind of idea. Thursday Afternoon, narrowly, a lot of those ambient records based on this idea of getting a number of ingredients to permutate in different ways. So I call that generative music. What happened a few years ago was that I started working with computers, and it became possible to design much more sophisticated ways of doing this. For instance, I have to give you an example of something that you can play, actually, if you don't mind, just so people can hear something, because just to talk theory like this is difficult. Well, in this piece that I'll give you, what you're hearing is a synthesizer being instructed to produce music according to sets of rules that I've put in the piece. Now, these sets of rules are not specific rules. They're probabilistic. So they describe a kind of envelope within which the piece can maneuver. For instance, in this one it says produce a new note on average every 5 to 12 seconds. Make that note roughly something between 4 to 8 seconds long. choose from within this series of notes which that note will be, choose this one more often than that one, choose this one hardly ever at all. When you produce other notes, harmonize them in these possible ways with those. So do you see what I mean? They're all instructions, but I don't know which particular expression of the instructions is going to be used at any given time. So it's like having it's like a many-dimensional structure. Within each dimension, the piece has certain amounts of freedom, and the permutation of all those freedoms is what this piece of music is.
Was it very difficult for you to develop something like that?
Well, it started, for me, this thing started with the realization that discrete music was a potentially endless piece of music, and I like the idea of that. I like the idea of music being like a painting. You know, when you put a painting on the wall, it doesn't fade out in 15 minutes. And you then put another one on. When you put a painting on the wall, it stays there, and you pay it attention when you want to. So it's stable, it's constant, and you are the changing part. Your attention shifts back and forth. And I thought, you know, for me, the beginning of ambient music was to try to make music like that. The idea of music being a sort of permanent condition of your environment, and or as permanent for as long as you wanted it. You know, you take it off when you don't want it anymore, obviously. And so I was trying to think of ways of making pieces of music that just stayed there. And so years ago I started thinking about a discrete music machine, which would be a way of installing that piece so that it goes on forever, or for as long as you want it.
So is that the problem of music, that you deal always with time?
Well, you know, it's an interesting thing. I think Walter Pater said at the turn of the century, or whenever he said it, all art aspires to the condition of music. This was at a time when painters were just moving towards abstraction, and the idea was that painting had been held in place and hampered by its figurative, you know, by having to be figurative. And, you know, painters so much wanted to invent completely abstract worlds, which is what you do in music. But actually I think that it's reversed now. I think people more and more, or musicians more and more, want to make things like paintings. They want to make things that create a condition into which you, the listener, immerse yourself. You know, music. One of the stories of music over this century, and particularly since the beginning of recording, is of making a form that is more and more immersive, more and more something that you dive into and exist inside, less and less something that you look at from the outside. You know, just look at the paradigm of orchestral listening, where the listener sits in a chair, static, and shouldn't even cough. You know, it's the most exclusionary. The engagement is totally mental. It's deliberately nothing to do with your body. You know, in a classical concert, it would even be very, very disruptive to tap your foot, wouldn't it? Let alone clap along with the music or start dancing. So, you know, one of the things that's happened, you know, even your headphones are an expression of this. One of the things that's happened both technically and psychologically in music is this continuous creation of more and more immersive environments, of ways in which you can really be inside the music. You know, when you wear a Walkman, you change your world. You put on a world of your choice, don't you?
said before something about thinking in collages, and also thinking in layers, because this has something to do with tape recording too, thinking in tracks.
Yes.
How much this thinking changed your mind?
Well, it's become completely the way in which I work. You know, 45 or 50 years ago, I couldn't have been a musician. I don't have any traditional music skills. So my whole way of working developed around the possibilities of tape recorders and studios, and in relation to the idea that, I studied as a painter. That was my background. And I suddenly found that because of these technologies, that music was another way of doing painting. You could paint just like you mix a color and you put it on, and then you mix another one, you put it on, and then you take some of the first one off, so on. All of the strategies that, as a painter, I was quite used to, I found that you could apply to music. So, in that sense, it's really a new medium, The fact that it's called music makes you think that it's in some way connected with what was going on before. The only connection is that it comes in through your ears.
Yeah.
This is, as I said, the only noise we hear here is the occasional plane going overhead.
Our sister today.
Don't worry, they're not so common, these planes.
But something that we see happening at festivals that were originally the domain for people who write scores.
Mm-hmm.
Like you were talking about the top of the hill, people sort of protecting themselves and their colleagues for other influences. You see that composition. Maybe you are one of the, in popular music, one of the pioneers for that, is that composition became, as a medium, available to a lot more people with the new technology.
Yes, for sure.
Does that redefine the whole craft of composition in your view also?
Well, yes, I think one of the things that, if you look at the history of pop music, one way of looking at it is as a history of new technologies that then invite new perceptions about how music is made. For instance, when the sampler appeared, samplers really appeared as ways of getting orchestras on your records. That's what it was. It was the updated mellotron, So you get a nice string sound or a nice piano or something like that. And for the first few years of samplers, that's basically what people were doing. It was very uninteresting, really. It was just trying to do something old in a cheaper way, really, or in a more convenient way. But what then started to happen was that people found you could actually take preformed pieces of music, existing pieces of music. Now, this called on a whole different set of musical skills, which were to do with the understanding of the cultural weight of different sounds and the cultural value of a scratchy record as opposed to a clean sound, the value of a kind of a bass line that you vaguely recognize from some hit record 17 years before. So it called into play a set of musical skills which weren't even considered musical skills before, like the skills of a DJ,
Yeah.
That was considered sort of a technical job. One of the things that has happened over and over again in pop music is that things that were considered technical have come to be seen as artistic. For instance, engineering. Engineering used to be a completely numb-brain sort of technical task of making sure the tape didn't overload and the meters stayed out of the red and so on. And then you got engineers like Conny Planck in Germany who realized that engineering was a place where you could be creative, a place where you actually were making the music. So engineering turns into something else. It becomes somewhere between being an artist and being a producer and being a technician. And that's happened over and over again, that pop music keeps inviting new talents. Talents that were never considered artistic become artistic. That's another sign for the future, I think, that it again calls into question this simple distinction between the artists and the audience. Suddenly it says, hey, the skills you've got, even though they seem at the moment a bit disconnected, actually can be rethought as artistic skills, creative skills.
So the blurring in a moment is very powerful. The blurring between
Yeah.
jobs, between
Yeah.
ideas and things.
Yeah.
So this gives us perhaps the power going further on.
Well, another thing that's very interesting about the now is, and this is another part of the connection to the future of the internet, is the idea of being able to choose identities and to have several different ones. I know a lot of people who work in the sort of hip-hop, trip-hop type area who have 4 or 5 different identities, and they release records under all these different names, and they're all group names, as if there's a lot of people involved in each one. It's the same person. In one of them he might have a friend help him out or something, But and similarly on the internet, you see this thing of people inventing a persona which is there, which floats out in the ether there, and who's a puppet of this person, really. Somebody asked me the other day, what did I think was the difference between the 60s and the 90s? Because there are many similarities. And I said that I thought the difference was that in the 60s, people were experimenting in quite a radical way, but the purpose of their experiments, if you had asked them, would probably be to find their real self. All right, the idea that if you strip away social constructions, underneath there's a real self. Mm-hmm. I think that's completely changed now. I think what happens in the 90s is that people understand that there are only social constructions, that there isn't a real self that is fixed and stays in one place, that there are lots of real selves, and they're all constructions of some kind, constructions that we make in collaboration with the rest of society, And so I think that the one of the keynotes of young people's self-image now is this feeling of fluidity, of being able to change themselves and slide into different roles and modes, and that's another clue for the 21st century, I think.
The first topic I would like to bring up is that we have recently met at a session you did with the Metropole Orchestra. You are now working on a, should I say, transcription of the Shutov Assembly from the original version to an orchestra. Mm-hmm. Could you start off by telling us something about the original version, how that originated?
I was making these pieces at the end of the 80s. In fact, from about 1985 to 1990, they cover. And they were all pieces made in much the same way as you would make a painting, of impressionistic, abstract pictures of places. Many of the pieces of music were things that I then used in my installations, so they had a dual job. They didn't just exist as pieces of music, they were also part of installations that I was making in various parts of the world. My intention when I was making these things was to try to make things that were right on the edge of music. That's to say that a lot of the sounds were not sounds you would associate with music. So I was trying to use a palette of instruments that was not familiar. And I'd become more and more interested in metallic sounds, and the sounds of ordinary organic things slowed down a great deal, like pieces of steel, bottles, pieces of wood, whatever. So there was within those pieces a range from completely unconventional sounds to conventional sounds as well. There are occasionally pianos in there and things like that. But I felt that any sound source was equally valid as a beginning point for these pieces. But also I had in my mind this idea that what would be really exciting eventually was to try to then play these pieces on conventional instruments. Now, that idea thrilled me because I thought, first of all, it would force conventional instruments to play in new ways that they weren't familiar with in order to try to replicate those sounds, but also because I knew they would fail. And I thought that in their failure it would produce a new sort of music somehow. It's a little bit like that party game we have called Chinese Whispers, where somebody whispers something into someone's ear very quietly and they have to whisper it into the next person's ear. And as it passes round, it changes into something else. The game is only fun if the whisper is not transmitted correctly, you know. And I felt that I could try to turn this music into something else just by the process of it failing to be replicated properly. So that was my idea, to eventually transcribe these things for... I wasn't thinking of an orchestra, I was thinking of a smaller unit than an orchestra, 25 players maybe. And in the early 90s I tried this experiment once, but it was so expensive I couldn't carry on with it. I worked with a group of players for a few days, and we succeeded in getting about 6 minutes of music done. It was very difficult, and as I say, it was very expensive. I couldn't continue with it. So here I was offered a whole orchestra. So I thought I'd revive that project again. But
in the translation of the original towards the instrument, how's the communication with the musicians? What language do you speak with them?
Well, the translation is a very good word, actually, because it's a translation failure that I'm looking for, really. But the translation of this music, this sound, into something that musicians can use is being done by Steve Gray, who's an English arranger. And I talked to Steve about what my intention was, and I said that really for me it was important not to try to turn these things into music, to actually try to replicate them. Okay, so I really wanted to see whether it was possible to push the envelope of orchestral instruments in some way, so that they had to play differently to try to make these kinds of noises. And so he tried to score things in such a way that that would happen. So for instance, to give you an example, in one piece there's a sound which I originally made by spinning a cable.
I thought it was a bird. Sometimes.
Yeah, that's right. It sounds like a bird. Exactly. Yeah. Yes, it's a cable spinning, but slowed down. So it's about 1/4 of the original speed, I think, or 1/8. Now, there's no orchestral instrument that makes a noise like that. In fact, there's nothing actually really that makes a noise like that, because it's a slowed down sound anyway. So in order to replicate that, or to make something like it, he used 2 snare drummers. One of them is scraping around the drum like that, and the other one has a muted drum, so he's scraping around that one, and it goes underneath. And then to get there's a sort of musical note in this spinning cable. To get that, he had a bass flute also going ooh, 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 and 3 or 4 violin players scraping the strings or tapping the strings with the back of their bows, with the wooden part of the bow. Because the other effect of this spinning cable was, as it turns in my fingers, it makes this clicking noise. So to get that one quite simple sound required 7 or 8 players, you see. But that's exactly the kind of thing I wanted to do, because actually the sound that he's got through that process is absolutely beautiful. It's quite different from my original in some ways, but it's a beautiful new sound that I've never heard an orchestra make before. And this is really an expression of the idea of trying to say, let's use this stupid exercise of trying to duplicate something that was done completely on synthesizers or with electronics, shall we say, let's use that as a way of making some new music, which is original music.
Besides an artistic event, it's also a tool of discovering what actually is hidden in this group of people.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It's actually a little bit like something that one does in painting a lot. You know, if you paint a portrait of someone or a still life, for example, obviously your intention isn't to make an indistinguishable copy of that original, but you try your hardest to do that. But your intention actually is to make something that stands on its own, to make something that has its own character and identity. And, you know, every drawing, in a sense, is a failure. Every figurative drawing is a failure because it doesn't really look like the three-dimensional object that it copies. But there's something about being tied to this discipline of trying to do something difficult, trying to do something which can be compared with its original and so on. There's something about that process that pushes you in a way that you would not push yourself otherwise. And, I mean, I got the impression that the musicians enjoyed this as well. There was a feeling of this was leading them to occasionally experience their instruments in new ways.
Has it changed your perspective of the original music?
Actually, it has somewhat, yes, because, of course, as soon as you start playing, writing the thing for players, you have to take the music apart. Well, that music has never been taken apart before, you see, because of the way I made it. I didn't really see the elements separately. I saw them as all belonging to part of this big picture. It's a little bit like, you know, if you took a Jackson Pollock painting, you just took all the white bits and then all the red bits, and you looked at them as separate pictures before they had been stuck back together again.
Like photoshopping.
Yes, exactly, like Photoshop. It's very interesting because it makes you aware of the possibility of the separateness of these things. And I find that some of these elements separately are very beautiful, actually. There's one piece that has this strange rolling bass. Dum 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 dum. It was in my mind when I did it, I had this idea of a little boat in the water rocking, but in a slightly uneven way that things rock in water, you know. And it's buried within this piece. But of course, when Steve scored this out, he had to try to think of a way of this being played, and he played it. It's two bass clarinets and a harp playing this part, and actually on its own, it's a very, very beautiful sound. So now, for the version we're going to do of this piece, I'm going to add a minute of that on its own at the beginning of the piece. So this is the other thing that's happening, that as parts stand out on their own and become successful in their own right, then the pieces are going to change shape to accommodate those.
What sounds interesting is that orchestras trying to do something with electronic music, and before we had that electronic music played classic.
Yes.
It's a very strange situation.
It is.
30 years,
it's a funny switch round, yes. And in fact, I think it's a much more interesting way around. You know, when people were trying to copy orchestras with electronics, well, that was only interesting again when it completely failed. You know, when you ended up with, for instance, those early Human League records with really cheap string sounds on them.
One more question about this, the story you told about working with the orchestra. Did you ever experience a gap between electronic music and acoustic performed music?
The biggest gap is well, there are two big gaps. One is that acoustic and performed music is location specific. It happens somewhere, and it has to happen in a place, you know. Those physical players have to be somewhere, and you have to go there to hear them. Recorded music is completely different from that, of course. When you make that kind of recorded music anyway, what you make is you build the world that this sound happens in using echoes and reverberation and so on and so on. You create a false acoustic, just like with a film, you create false lighting and so on and so on. So making recorded music is like making a film as compared to making a piece of theatre, which is what acoustic music is like. The other big difference is about the social structure involved in the way each of these different kinds of music is made. If you I have this feeling anyway that the orchestra is basically a very old-fashioned structure, like the army and the church. It's a hierarchical, highly organized, top-down, what they call a top-down structure. Control is from the top downwards. Now, I know this is changing. I'm certainly aware, working with this orchestra, that information flows both ways. It's not the sort of classical picture of the totally dominant conductor. People talk to each other about what's possible and what isn't. Nonetheless, the image of the orchestra is still the social structure of the orchestra is old-fashioned, I think. However, as I say, with this particular orchestra, I thought, this is a new kind of thing going on here. It's different from what I've experienced with orchestras before. And I think it's probably because they're not specifically a classical orchestra. It's a pop, variety, jazz, and classical orchestra. So I think because they have this connection with popular music and the way it works, it's loosened them up as an orchestra anyway.
How does your role as a composer contribute to that change?
Well, because I'm not a composer in the sense that they are probably used to. I'm not someone who writes scores. It puts me in the position of having to, and wanting actually, to talk directly to the musicians and say, no, that's not quite what I meant. How would you make it a little bit more liquid or a bit more sharp or something like that? I tend to use those kinds of words. And when you say something like that, of course, what you're saying to a musician is use your own intelligence and your own experience of the instruments to interpret that word. What does liquid mean, in terms of a clarinet or something? And this is the way I would work with any musicians in the studio. I would never say to someone, "Now I think you should try a B flat followed by a G," and I don't know how to talk like that anyway. I talk in more in descriptive, impressionistic ways anyway.
You were working with the orchestra as you do now. Could it have an effect on future compositions that you do? For instance, with electronics, has it changed your attitude towards your own composing? As I shouldn't call it. I won't know really until you do. Until I start working again, yes, and see. I mean, I think the thing that does change, actually, the thing I've been aware of increasingly over the last 10 or 15 years is that natural instruments are irreplaceable. You can't copy them. You can't replace them. And when I was younger and composing, I used to think, well, who needs all these weird, archaic things? Because they are weird natural instruments, like a bassoon or a bass clarinet or something. They're so complicated and strange, and they only make one sound. To someone who's used to playing synthesizers, where you have thousands of sounds at your fingertips, there, you tend to think these instruments can't survive, they're too specialized. But actually, it's not the instruments that are important, it's the relationship that the player has with the instrument. And those relationships are very, very developed and evolved.
No synthesizer player knows their instrument like those people in the orchestra know their instruments. A synthesizer player has too many options to ever become really, really that familiar with them. So I think what survives is this, and what will always survive is this highly evolved rapport between a particular, quite small vocabulary of sounds that a classical instrument represents, and a human being. And that will not get replaced. You can have brilliant samplers that sound exactly like the original instrument, but that doesn't give you the same rapport that the original player has with that instrument. So if you think of an instrument not as a sound, but as a relationship between somebody and a little sound language, then certainly classical players are very highly evolved, or players of traditional instruments, I would say. You get it with electric guitars. There are people who play electric guitars with exactly the same kind of deeply evolved relationship as classical players, but you don't get it often with synthesizers.
You don't think this old Moog revival?
I think that's the main reason for those revivals. Actually, it's not because those things sound so amazing. They sound nice, and we're familiar with the sounds, but it's because they're so limited that it's possible for people to understand them. If you're going to understand something and work with it, you have to know what the boundaries of it are. You have to have some sense of the things it can't do as well as the things it can do. And when you're presented with keyboards that come with 2,400 different sounds built in, and you can edit them all anyway, so that you can multiply those by another 100,000. It's the Chinese restaurant problem, where you're terribly hungry and you go in and sit down and they bring you a 45-page menu, and 3/4 of an hour later you're still looking through it.
What that means for the technical evolution we have now, because if this possibility is getting bigger and bigger, like internet and all that, that also meant that people getting more and more involved in it?
Yes, well, I think two things are happening. One is that people are becoming much better at collage, in the sense that instead of trying to develop those kinds of deep relationships with sounds and with ways of playing, they say, I don't need to do that, I'll just stick things together. And if you're sticking things together, you often want to stick together things that already come ready-made with a lot of historical and cultural associations. A lot of sampling is like that, where you take a bit of an old Tamla record that everyone sort of recognizes, and a bit from somewhere else that everyone recognizes. So the instrument that you're having a relationship there is not the sound, it's the history of popular music culture. That's your instrument, and your work is an exploration of that relationship. But the other thing that's going on, and it's almost exactly at the other extreme, is this thing that you point out, this reaction to retro instruments, coming back to early simple electronic instruments and saying, I'm going to deliberately choose a limited world to work in. This is quite anti-technological in a sense, because manufacturers still generally think that the more options they can put in something, the better the product is. But musicians, more and more, and musicians often lead the world in terms of the use of electronic equipment. Musicians more and more are saying, actually, I don't want a million options. Just give me something that does two things really well, like a Fender Stratocaster or a Moog synthesizer. Just give me something like that, and so I can develop a relationship with it. I don't want something that is constantly changing shape. What happens in musical equipment is often what happens in other technological stuff. I think that this will be how computers will go as well. People will stop wanting computers that can do absolutely everything in the world, and they'll start wanting to say, actually, I want a simple computer.
You meant that we are not able in the moment to look forward, but always we look back.
No, I didn't mean that. I mean that we do both things together. We keep developing new ways of dealing with things, and some of those new ways are actually old ways revived, you know. For instance, I think it is genuinely radical after centuries of people saying that more choices equals more freedom. I think it is genuinely radical to say, I want less choices. Actually, it's the expression of, you know, the less is more philosophy that filtered through from the East, you might say, has now become a popular idea. Ordinary people say it all the time. I don't want such a complicated computer. The people in there say it. My accountant says, I don't want to have all these options. I want something simple. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a sort of what was, even 20 years ago, kind of quite a radical and surprising thing to say. Less is more. People would say, what do you mean? How can it be? It sounded like a paradox, you know. It doesn't sound like a paradox to anyone anymore. Everyone knows that it's the way you have to make choices sometimes. Mm. So I think we keep innovating or understanding new ways of dealing with things, and some of those new ways look like old ways of dealing with things, but they aren't really. I mean, when Moogs were around, when they came out in the late 60s and early 70s, everyone who played one wanted more. They wanted bigger Moogs, they wanted more options. It's only now, looking back, we start to say, actually it was good that they didn't have all those more options. It was because they didn't have those options that people could become familiar with them and start to use them and develop a relationship with them. But at the time, nobody felt at all romantic about the limitations of Moogs. It just seemed like it was technically crude at the time.
Would you say that perception of music, as you described it in the concert hall, and that the role of the music, that it can be perhaps play a role which has more to do with your emotional or physical feeling, could be something that could be found in older music than is generally programmed in the concert halls, like old religious music?
Yes. Well, you see, I think we in the West have a picture of music that is based on a very, very small aberration from what the rest of the history of music has been about. You know, Western classical music is very, very unusual. In terms of the history of music, it's very particular. And yet we've based our whole... We use that as the standard of what music should be like, and we compare everything else to it. But actually the experience of music for most of the world, for most of the time, has been much more like pop music or folk music. Music has always been, except in the highest court traditions, which is what classical music is actually, it's a high court tradition. Music has always been something that everybody joined in with, and that actually everybody in some way or another could do as well. You know, the other thing that characterizes classical music is a very sharp distinction between the people who can do it and the people who listen to it. That's a new distinction too. You know, of course, in any traditional grouping, you have people who do it better than others, but there's not this really sharp divide between the doers and the listeners. There are some specialists and there are some people who are really bad at it, but then there's a whole range in between of people who can join in or not. I wrote this essay a little while ago. It was printed in this magazine called Whole Earth Review. Was that in that? I think so, yeah. And it's a really good little essay about Carnival. It just has one sentence after another. Actually, when we get back, I'd love to read it, because I'm pleased with this little essay. I'll just make a note of that. Okay, so this piece is called Carnival as a Model for Culture. So I started thinking about what made for a great carnival. And I realized that nearly everything that makes for a great carnival is what also makes for a great culture. So my conclusions about what makes for a great carnival. Carnival is good when the number of participants isn't grossly outweighed by the number of spectators. Carnival is good when many of the spectators are actually also joining in, dancing and singing along. Carnival is good when the participants exhibit a range of skills from the absolutely minimal to the absolutely astonishing. The first is an invitation not to be intimidated. Hey, I could do that. And the second is an invitation to be amazed. Carnival is good when people of all ages, sexes, races, shapes, sizes, beauties, inclinations and professions are involved. Carnival is good when there's too much to look at and everything's mixed up and you have to sort it all out for yourself. Carnival is good when it dignifies and rewards all sorts of abilities. Singing, jumping, laughing infectiously, dressing weirdly, writing the hit song of the carnival, wiggling your backside, standing on a soapbox praising Jesus or the local hardware store, frying salt fish over an oil drum in public, inventing symphonic arrangements for steel bands, designing and building fabulously impossible things. Carnival is good when people try to outdo each other and then applaud with delight those who in turn outdo them. Carnival is good when it gives people an alibi to become someone different. Carnival is good when it lets people present the best part of themselves and be for a little while as they'd like to be all of the time. Carnival is good when it gives people the feeling that they're really lucky to be alive right here and now. Carnival is good when it leaves people with the feeling that life in all its bizarre manifestations is unbeatably lovely and touching and funny and worthwhile.
Brian, two questions about World Ecology Forum and War Child. Two movements in your life from the 90s.
Yeah, they both come from an instinct which has become much stronger in me lately, and maybe it's something that happens to people as they get older. When I lived in New York, which was in the late 70s and early 80s, I knew quite a few celebrities and rich people, and it used to very much surprise me that I'd go to visit them and they would live in some desperately awful part of New York with broken streets and no trees, dead people, muggings going on. But then you'd go into their apartment and it was like a palace. And this disjunction between the little bit that you own and the rest of the city struck me as very weird. I thought that was particularly a New York thing. And I would say to people, do you like living here? And they'd say, oh, it's fantastic, and they'd say it's fantastic looking at their apartment. But when I said here, what I realized I meant was the neighborhood, the whole place. But I realized that in New York, here, H-E-R-E, was a very small place. Here was the bit that I can lock the door on. That's where I live. Whereas I think a more European instinct is to think that here is at least the neighborhood and probably the city, And I also noticed the same thing about the word now. In New York, when people said now, what they meant was between last weekend and next weekend. And this is very exciting in a way because it means that there's constantly new things coming up, things that haven't been finished are appearing, and it's all thrilling and exciting, and I love that about New York. But I realized it also meant that nobody took responsibility for anything, for any longer-term view of things. So I came up with this phrase called the long now and the big here. and I thought that one of the things that made societies and cultures attractive is the degree to which they had a sense of the long now and the big here. Actually, there is going to be a future. we now are stuck with two problems. First of all, we're not sure if there is going to be a future anyway. Because of we all grew up with the nuclear threat, so now we have ecological threats and environmental threats and so on. So we're not even completely secure in the idea that there is a future. And the second thing is, everything changes so quickly. We have no idea what it's going to be like. We think, how can we possibly make any plans or put anything in place for a future when we just can't even guess what it's going to be like? So these two problems sort of paralyze us. We're paralyzed in another way as well, in that we're frightened of our own power. We're now in a world which is incredibly interconnected, where we can't ignore what's going on in China or what's going on in South Africa or what's going on in Yugoslavia. We can't ignore it. We can't help but be aware of it. We're constantly being told about it. And we feel torn as human beings between the fact that something terrible is going on, and we know we have huge power. We're more powerful as a species than we ever have been before, and we're frightened of using it because we've seen things go badly wrong in the past. We've seen attempts to help turn into disasters. We don't want to be imperialists, we don't want to push our weight around. So we have this other problem which tends to turn us into isolationists. We tend to retreat from that problem completely and say, actually, we just can't deal with it. It's too complicated. We're not even going to concern ourselves. We'll look inside. We'll look at our little world. So we in global terms as well, we're stuck in a small here problem. So we have a short now and a small here built into a lot of our thinking. Now, War Child and the Long Now are two attempts to open, certainly my mind, to the responsibility of being a powerful member of the human species, being a powerful member of a powerful species, actually, and taking responsibility for it. I can't any longer say that I can't be laissez-faire about it,
Did you get a shock first time if you got to Mostar, for example? Was it a big shock for you to see this real situation? Because it's different like in New York, because there's really a war there.
Yes, it's very shocking. The most shocking thing, actually, is the war wasn't on when I first went there. The war in Mostar had finished. There was still a lot of, and there still is a lot of bad feeling, but there wasn't much shooting going on. So I walked into a completely ruined city, and what really sticks in my mind is the image is seeing buildings which have received so many bullets that on the whole of a 4-story building you couldn't put your hand anywhere on the surface without touching a bullet hole. Can you imagine the level of hatred to shoot that many times at a building, to bombard it with shells? And this is the front line. These buildings were across the street from each other. These were people who had lived together, and had been friends and colleagues and even husbands and wives, and it was shocking to see that how easily propagandized humans are, actually, because that's what that war was about. It was Milosevic was able to propagandize a people, and in turn, to resist him, they propagandized themselves. It made me think a lot about the power of media, because it was a media war, really. The Serbs were able to create a culture of the victim.
You said something about that the human beings are quite far, and at the other side, we are not learning so much from the last 500, 600 years. Is it not a little kind of shame for us, how the human beings, or is it some contradiction in ourselves?
Yeah, I think it is a contradiction. I have a very optimistic view of humans, actually. When I think of our successes as a species, one of them being actually that we haven't obliterated ourselves. Since for 45, 50 years now, we've had nuclear weapons. And actually we've had biological and chemical weapons as well. Surprisingly, we're still here. And that is actually that's an achievement, I think. And I think there are a lot of other achievements. There's a vast cooperative structure in medicine, in science, even in economics and politics. In many ways, we are trained, and again, it's a media effect. We're trained to see the problems and to see the contradictions and to see the stresses. But actually, if you think of the huge cooperation that's involved in keeping a city like this going, it's a huge cooperative enterprise. When we look at Ants' Nest, we say, oh, that's amazing how all those little ants can keep this thing going. Well, compare an ant's nest to a city. This is a lot more amazing, or certainly as amazing. So I'm generally a big supporter of the human race. I think we don't do too badly at all. And there's another factor as well, which is, of course, in the last 50 years, there's been more change, more new and complicated things to cope with than in the previous 200. And in that 200, there was more change than in the previous 10,000, So you have this effect of this incredible acceleration, constantly new conditions, new things to deal with, new things to have to understand. And yet we're not all mad. We're actually surprisingly sane. If you'd said to my great-grandfather, okay, we're going to design a society where every few weeks you're going to have to work with new tools that you've never experienced before, and they're not going to work properly. Where you have transport systems of amazing complexity, where the political scene changes every year or so, where currencies are changing, he would have said, forget it. There's no chance of people being able to cope with that. So we're not doing too badly, actually.
Perhaps he could have said, why?
Yes, he could have said why. And that's a very good question. This kind of acceleration. Well, when we were talking earlier about the people re-embracing retro tools, that's part of, I think, a very healthy act of choice. Because of course the market stimulus is to always take the newer thing. Of course it is, that's where the money is for the market. And it's interesting when people actually resist that and say, no, I'm not going to. That's not what I want. It's another sign of hope that people are capable of making those kinds of distinctions. I like this kind of mess that you see at a carnival where you're never sure who is doing what and how good they are at it or whether it matters anyway,
This has something to do also with the multicultural living anyway, because we get so many different nationalities now in Europe. So
yeah.
For sure, perhaps it's happened like that.
Yeah. Yeah, the other way is fascism of various kinds, Haider and Jean-Marie Le Pen and so on. They're the resistance to this, because this is sort of frightening in a way, because it's very vague and nobody knows where they're going to be in it. There's no guarantee that you're going to come out at the top of the heap here. You could come out right at the bottom. So, yeah, it's an intimidating prospect, and I think I think the job of politicians now should be to address this and to say, not to say, don't worry, we're going to get it back to how it was before, because we aren't. But even liberal politicians basically are saying we're going to get it back to how it was before. We should really have the courage to stop pretending that and say it isn't going to go back to how it was before. It's going to be a mess. So let's think about it now. Popular culture is one of the continual research projects to try to find other ways of doing things. One of the sub-stories of popular culture is the story of very small groups of people changing the world, actually. The Beatles was 4 people, basically. And arguably those 4 people were more powerful than the Chinese army have been in the last 30 years.
His influence about what the Beatles had 20, 30 years ago, and also your engagement now in the society, do you think something would be pushed on with the power of music, with power of pop music, of course, like the Beatles did 30, 40 years ago? It was different.
Well, pop music then was the center of a conversation that people were having, and the music wasn't really the important part of it. Actually, the important part was, first of all, creating a locus around which people could have conversations with each other. They could identify with each other because of sharing this common cultural language. But I think the other important part was what I said earlier about the proposal of a new kind of model about how culture comes into being and who the culture belongs to and who has a right to take part in it. And, when suddenly a group of young people, very young people actually, became the most important cultural force, that was a big message to every other young person. Hey, the culture is ours. We can take part in it, So what I would look for now is, where is the same kind of thing happening? Where is the same kind of sense of empowerment taking place? And, for all the hype and rubbish that's talked about the internet, that is definitely the place where it's going to happen. This is the place where suddenly people can create their own identities, have their own shop window, if you like. They can show themselves in whatever way they want, and they can have some kind of a global presence suddenly. It's very exciting. It's unfortunate that it hasn't been taken over by that many very bright people yet. But I see it like the beginning of rock and roll. It grows out of something, but actually it becomes something completely different.
You want to grow too with the whole movement in the next years? Doing live things on internet, perhaps also with picture, with viewing things? Live.
Yeah, all of that is the stuff I think is not interesting. I think that's the past in a way. Whenever there's a new medium appearing, the first thing people try to do is all the things they used to do in the past. Then they try to think, how can we do that now in this medium? But actually what always happens is that the medium develops its own, not only its own language, but its own things that only it can do. The history of recording is a good example of where it started out as a way of putting concerts onto records. So you could have a concert in your own home. That was the beginning, and in fact that was until, I'd say 25 years ago, that's what most people, or 30 years ago, that's what people thought recording was for. It was taking music that existed and putting it onto a record that you could then play at home. But gradually people started discovering that you could make music in these places called recording studios that couldn't exist otherwise. And so a whole musical language has grown up, which really depends entirely on that medium. It only exists in that medium. And this is what I think this is what I'm waiting for, I suppose. And it does happen. There are signs of it on the internet, but I think it won't be very much to do with redoing forms that we already know, or at least that won't be the exciting part of it.
But do you think that has something to do with putting a greater responsibility to people, that they get the feeling they are more responsible for their own well-being on a larger scale?
I hope so. Yes, I think... well, it says to people... It has an important political message as well, which is connected to that, which is, you are responsible. You know, if you start getting rid of these ideas that you are who you are and nothing will ever change it, I think that starts to lead you towards a frame of mind where you can't justify ethnic conflicts like what you saw in former Yugoslavia. I mean, it becomes absurd to say, I'm a Serb and I was born a Serb, and I'm a Croat and I was born a Croat. You just think, that's old-fashioned, you know. You can't support those kinds of arguments so easily anymore. And of course, most of the sophisticated people in those countries didn't. That was a war of village people against town people, basically. And part of the war was about that issue. You know, of a rural population who wanted to hang on to those old values, and a city population that was drifting away from them, particularly Sarajevo, which was considered dangerously pluralistic and, you know, irreligious and all that sort of thing. Yes.
We are now at the virtual end of 8 hours of radio with you, Brian. And a lot of the 2 programs have yet to be made. A lot of segments have yet to be made. But even though we are in that phase, how do you suggest we finish these 8 hours of radio?
Phew. I should have asked me that a few hours ago. I would have had time to think about it. It's very hard. It's very hypothetical, isn't it? What could we think of as a good ending?
And we'd like to thank you for your time and your input.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for asking very interesting questions, I have to say.
Okay. Thank you.